Welcome to the Nonprofit Digital Success Podcast. I'm your host, David, and today I have Carol Hamilton on the show. Allow me to introduce her. Carol is a principal at Grace Social Sector Consulting, located in the DC area. She's a strategic thinker, and Carol works with organizations to envision their future strategy. How amazing is that? She's practical in her approach. She helps organizations think through who is key in creating their future, how to gather insights, imagine new possibilities, come to an agreement on future goals, and create an action plan. And with more than 25 years of nonprofit experience, Carol trains on leadership, strategy, and innovation topics, and she has her master's degree in organization development. Carol's also a fellow podcast host. Carol, tell us about your show and what it's called.
Thank you first for having me on the show. It's great to be here. And my podcast is called Mission Impact. It's the podcast for nonprofit leaders who want to do good in the world without being a martyr to the cause.
That's amazing. So if you're listening to this, listen to the whole episode and then go and find Carol's podcast afterwards. Subscribe. There's some really great topics that she covers in there. And yes, a formal welcome. Thank you so much, Carol, for jumping on the Nonprofit Digital Success Podcast. Great to have you here. So I've got, really high level question for you. I'll just, lob that softball at you. What is strategic planning?
It really is a process to help organizations and really the people within organizations, because that's what organizations are. They're networks of people, come together and have conversations so that they're all clear on where they're headed, where they want to go, and how they're going to get there. For me, I think the value that it brings is that chance to kind of step back and think about the bigger picture and think about the longer term. But usually they focus in on kind of the next 3 to 5 years. For most organizations, that's a reasonable amount of time to kind of think ahead.
Yeah, so it's not immediate. It's not like the next 90 day or 1 year. It's kind of like I would call that maybe mid-range kind of forecasting and strategy for 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and I mean, people have kind of questioned whether strategic planning is even relevant anymore with our world being, that acronym, the VUCA, volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. That's what we swim in these days, and certainly the last several years have if folks weren't convinced of that before, they certainly should be now. But at the same time, I would say don't just throw it all out. You can still decide where you want to go and make sure that everyone's in alignment and that you're moving forward in a direction that you've all agreed on.
As a business owner, like I have an agency, right? It's really important to have a strategy. You need to know where your compass is pointed so that you and your team and your organization as a whole can travel in that direction, and everybody is kind of, paddling in the same direction to help you get to where you want to be. And it's a really important piece for people to understand that, you need to have your core set of values and understanding about what your organization does, but you need to know what the ultimate plan is 3 or 5 years. If the plan is to raise $1 million so you can set up a new business or a new wing of your facility, or tackle a certain thing, you need to have that, and you need to create all the different pieces to help you get there, right? It's not like, oh, I want to do this and it's just done. It takes time.
Right. It takes time, and it takes thinking through kind of how are we going to do that? What are the obstacles we need to face? And just making sure that you're actually in alignment. And I think that's one thing that leaders can often maybe be a little concerned about when they launch into a strategic planning process, that they've got so many stakeholders and, all of the staff, the board, and folks have all sorts of ideas about what they should do, what they could do. And so there, a fear that people have kind of coming into strategic planning is around, how are we going to align all of that? How are we going to take all that input and kind of make some decisions about what's important? But what's been interesting for me in working with organizations is that once we get into it and we start having those conversations, what I find is that actually there's more alignment already there than people realize. And so kind of framing up those conversations gives people the opportunity to see that and kind of have that sigh of relief. I've often had that with clients where, the takeaway from the session is, oh, I feel so much better because now I realize, folks are feeling the same way as me, or, they have the same aspirations, they have the same concerns, kind of that validation of being more in alignment than they realize.
Thing, right? It means that
Yeah.
organizationally, you've got the right values and the right people in the team that are helping you get to where you want to be, and everybody's like buying into what the organization wants to do and achieve. And I think that that's a really important thing. Going through strategic planning, what are some of the common mistakes that organizations tend to make when they're engaging in that process?
Yeah, I think so out of that fear of how can we assimilate all this information and input from so many different stakeholders, and what kind of expectations will we raise if we involve them? I think sometimes leaders will try to kind of tamp down the process and make it feel more manageable so they have less people involved, which is efficient, which, again, feels manageable. But what it can do is you then, they go forth with the plan, they come up with a plan, and then they tell everyone else, and then wonder why everyone else isn't as excited about it as they are. And so, really being more open at the front end of being willing to hear and engage with a variety of different stakeholders, internal and external, but then also being clear with those stakeholders, how are you using that information? It's not that we're going to just come up with this laundry list of everything that everyone wants and not have to make some decisions. How is that information going to be distilled? And then who's going to be using it, and then who's ultimately going to be making some decisions around the goals.
Yeah, and I
So that's
think I'm
one.
gonna, say something that I love to say. I say it all the time. You need to get the inside on side. It's really about, getting the engagement from the staff, the volunteers. If you're dealing with families of clients or this or that, like you need to really engage on multiple different levels. And I think some people are maybe afraid of what that actually means, and maybe the amount of work and time and effort that's needed from their side. Do you find that that's kind of what happens?
Well, when groups bring a consultant in, oftentimes the consultant will be able to take on a lot of that information gathering of doing those interviews, managing focus groups, synthesizing all that information for the board and staff to then be able to work through and make meaning of, and to then be able to make decisions. And I think another thing about starting too small, I think there also has been this traditional notion that there's a real kind of bright line between what does staff do and what does the board do, and the board being the only ones who are kind of tasked with strategy. And I would really challenge that. Not to say that you want to have your board kind of getting into the staff lane of like worrying about operations, or getting into the nitty gritty of who's sitting at what table and what fundraising event. You want to keep a board out of operations and kind of thinking higher level. But I feel like there really needs to be a conversation with board and staff, because ultimately it's that entire group that's going to make, and volunteers, that's the group that's going to make all of this happen. And so each brings its own perspectives, its own experience. And I'm not really a believer in, that there's kind of this sense of, if you're higher up in the organization, you're the ones doing strategic thinking. And if you're, further down, closer to the front line, you're not. And I just don't necessarily believe in that dichotomy. I think everyone's capable of strategic thinking. It's just kind of, how do you frame the conversation? How do you bring people in? And sometimes it makes folks uncomfortable, whether they're board or staff, if they just are more kind of operationally oriented. Asking them to think big picture, think about longer term trends, visioning can be uncomfortable, but it all helps to move, make that final product more meaningful.
Yeah, I think it's really important to empower your staff to, one, maybe make their job more efficient. Maybe there's something that they can do. Not even talking about like the strat planning side of things, right? But you've hired them for a reason, for the role that they have, because they're experts or they're really fantastic at job X, Y, or Z, and they can get it done and really help your organization in that way. But empowering them and bring them into conversations, brainstorming sessions, roundtable conversations, things like that. I think there's lots of ways that organizations can definitely engage the staff And I've worked in nonprofits for 16 years. What I found is once staff are engaged, it actually tends to tick upwards in terms of like staff happiness and KPIs and their impression of the organization. So there's more to this than just, okay, we need to strat plan. There's a lot of other ways that it kind of filters down.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of kind of ripple effect benefits of really being mindful of how you're engaging people. And I think it also just, people are like, why would we do that? We've got so much on our plate. And it just gives everyone an opportunity to kind of like lift their eyes up a little bit from today's to-do list, or what's worrying you about all the meetings you've got to get prepped for next week, but like what's a little further down the line, what's a little bit bigger, why are we really all here doing all of this? It helps people reconnect to that as well.
Absolutely. Which this is a great, segue into my next question is who needs to be involved or who should be involved in strat planning?
Yeah, so that's often a conversation that I'll have at the very beginning, whether it's with a core team of staff or usually often a strategic planning committee that includes both board members and staff members. And we go through a process to really brainstorm who are the organization stakeholders, what is the ecosystem that they're working within, and also to think about kind of where are they in terms of their organizational life cycle, because that process of gathering information from people can really work at a number of different levels. It could be if an organization has never done this kind of process before. It could be just that needs to be a basic organizational assessment of where are they, what are their strengths, what are their challenges, what are their aspirations. Or it could be at a higher level of thinking, what are the big strategic questions that we're thinking about, because they already have some really good processes in terms of gathering information. But I have a feeling I lost track of the question, which I think was who, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked
So
about.
who is there anybody? Is there like a job title that's like, all right, these are the four people that always need to be there, or does it change based on the organization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, well, we've named two. I think board and staff definitely need to be involved in some way. And then the external stakeholders are going to really depend on what is the purpose of the organization. What kind of work are they doing and who do they do it with? So who are their partners? Who are their funders? Are they heavily involved in the political process? Is that are those key constituents for them? You mentioned the folks that the organization supports or serves. How are you involving them in the decision making? And there's more and more emphasis on the folks who are really living whatever the issue is that the organization is working on, really need to be integral into making decisions. So how are you involving them as well? So it can be kind of more from the internal side. Who are your key volunteers? It's just looking at the organization. What's the work that you're doing? And then who matters to that work. But I think, at basis, pretty much staff and board are always going to be involved in some way in your key volunteers.
I have a couple follow-up questions from that. Is there an easier way or a specific method that you could recommend to help get external stakeholders involved in the process and like be willing to join and take time out of their lives?
Yeah, mostly with external stakeholders, depending on what the relationship is. It's often the case where it's asking them to do a half-hour interview with either a member of the strategic planning committee or with the consultant to just get their perspective, get their some perspective on the organization. It may be that they actually don't really know much about the organization, but they're very knowledgeable about the field, and so then you'd be asking them about trends and things like that. So it's not that they're going to be there at the retreat or in the series of online sessions that are about deciding the future of the organization, but it's more like having a conversation, maybe inviting them to a focus group, that kind of thing.
It's really fascinating. One of the things that we do is we have like our discovery process that we go through, and we talk about like personas, and we build out some avatars and things like that. Is that something that you might do or consider doing as part of the strategic planning, like in order to help inform what that end result is?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I think probably if an organization has, one of the things that I always want to find out when I'm working with them is what other discovery processes have been gone through recently have they done a survey of their members? Have they, recently just finished a project like you might do with a website where they've done all that analysis and they have those avatars of, typical folks who are coming to their website and things like that. And then to build on that, right? To not assume that they're just a blank slate, but know that they've been doing a lot of work. And so how do we do that kind of next step? So you could say that those stakeholder groups might kind of fit into those avatars, but they're probably more on the traditional side of what are the groupings of folks that they can think of, within their ecosystem that are key to their future.
I always think it's important as an organization to think about things through the lens of the people that either use or buy your products or come in and participate or volunteer or donate, right? And being able to think of it through their eyes, kind of break down those silos that tend to happen at organizations that are a little bit bigger, and think about things through their eyes really clarifies and cleans up any misconceptions that might be out there.
Yeah, so that could be a really useful process to kind of help the group, once you've gathered information from all those different groups, think about, so, we tend to think about them in these buckets, but what's showing up in between those in terms of these different personas of the folks that we serve, the folks that we, are working with to move our mission forward.
How would you approach, I guess, starting strategic planning or that initial process that needs to happen when you're about to embark on strategic planning? How do you do that with nonprofits and NGOs?
Yeah, so I mean, oftentimes there's a fair amount of a process before they pick up the phone and start calling. Who do you recommend who helps organizations do this kind of thing? So it's important to know, is this just one person who thinks this is important to do? Is there kind of a critical mass among the leadership of the organization that really wants to invest the time and energy? Because it is an investment. I do try to, when I'm approaching, I say, I want to make strategic planning fun. I don't want it to be this onerous process. I've heard people describe other strategic planning processes that they've gone through as like, well, I don't want to, endure that soul-sucking experience again. So I'm really trying to, make it not heavy, and kind of keep the momentum going. But in terms of getting started, it's often like having a conversation of, starting to think, are we all on the same, playing field in terms of where we want to go? And talking with your board about the need for it. There's some times when you don't want to do it if the organization is in a major crisis. It's not a time to try to think 3 to 5 years in advance. You're dealing with the next week, the next month, the next 6 months. So I've worked with groups where they came saying that they wanted strategic planning, but once we got a little bit further into it, it became really clear that they were in a crisis, or they were kind of emerging from a crisis, and so as much as they could plan out was going to be 6 to 12 months, and so that's what we did. But in terms of once they pick up the phone and start talking to, if they decide to have external support, and of course I'm biased in that arena, but I do think it brings value to have somebody who's managing the process who has no vested interest in the outcome. And it also enables folks who are in those leadership positions, whether it's the board chair or the executive director, to really be a participant in the process and not have to be thinking about managing the process. And, a lot of groups will then decide they have to do an RFP. And I'd say, please don't, please just have conversations with people and see if there's a fit. And then if you need a proposal, go from there.
Yeah, I really like what you said in there about, okay, fine, you're biased. Totally get that. I think everybody listening will understand and appreciate that. But really, hiring an outside body to come in, it brings in a certain level of expertise because you're bringing in like the person that has done this over and over and over again and has seen the trends. It can really help you quickly get through the process and as painlessly as possible instead of trying to cobble it together or try to have somebody that, maybe they went through a strategic planning at an organization they were at previously, but they're not really the experts. And there is something to be said for bringing in somebody who can bring the best practices from multiple organizations that they've done this with before.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that can be valuable is when something emerges in all of the discovery, in the interviews and the focus groups and the surveys. I've worked with various organizations where they're in that one of those transitional stages between kind of levels of maturity of the organization development, and so I can help them kind of normalize the fact that, okay, say you're going from a founder to the next generation. Here are the common things that are going to be happening. Here are the common challenges. And it goes back to that kind of like, oh, we're not alone. This isn't something uniquely bad about us, that we're doing something wrong. It's just the typical growing pains that an organization has when it's going from phase 2 to phase 3 or whatever it might be. So those are also kinds of things that I can bring in, or any consultant can kind of help bring some context, some broader context to an organization that will help just bring a different perspective to their particular situation.
I've gone through strat planning a couple of times at the organizations that I worked at, and there was always a little bit of a contentious debate: on-site or off-site. What's your take?
Well, now it's not even, it's on-site, off-site, or online.
Fair.
And the last several years, of course, we've been doing all of it online, and I've actually found that there's quite a bit of value in that. The kind of traditional model used to be you bring everybody together. I would say ideally in an offsite, because that gets people away from their day to day to help them think bigger.
Right.
But of course, online, you're not necessarily getting away from your day to day. Your email and whatnot may be there. So I always invite people. It's like, okay, can we close those off at least for these 2 hours that we're working on this piece? But the value in kind of splitting it up and not having it be a 1-day marathon, where you get to the point in the day when everyone's just wiped, and that's when you have to actually make some decisions when nobody's brain is working. Splitting it up into smaller segments and doing it over a couple weeks can actually have some value, because people, one, you're just taking one bite at a time, and then people also have time to kind of think and process and internalize this last conversation to be ready for the next one. So I would say either offsite or online.
Fair enough. So option C, online. So nonprofits, we know there can be challenges, right? You were talking a little bit about RFP process, right? And see, having those kind of conversations. Aside from RFP, not RFP, quote, that type of thing, what else do you find makes strat planning maybe a little bit more challenging in the nonprofit space?
I mean, I just think the folks are overwhelmed. We've definitely been. I mean, it was before the pandemic that folks were talking about burnout and just how much people are working, and how stretched folks are in terms of the needs that they're trying to address, the issues that they're trying to address, and then of course it's just even more so now. So I think there's just the press of the data, of the current challenge, and so it can feel almost luxurious to take that step back and pick your eye off of today's to-do list and look a little bit longer. But at the same time, I would say it's really an investment in the organization to bring people together and have those conversations.
Right. If there's any kind of question that somebody should be thinking about before they come into that first interview or that first stakeholder engagement meeting that you might hold, are there any questions they should be thinking about to help get their mind into that strategic thinking mode?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, oftentimes I'll work with the strategic planning committee to identify what those questions are. At what level are we working? What are the big strategic issues that the organization needs to grapple with? And so those will then be integrated into that whole process of getting input. And usually where I start with the group where we're really moving into the planning process is to start with the feedback of what I've heard from this wider range of stakeholders. And so that grounds them in how do people see the organization now? What are the challenges that they see? What are the strengths that they see? And then we often end up with that kind of laundry list, or I kind of call it, well, here's your buffet of all the different things people are talking about what you might be able to do, what they think might be useful to work on in the future. And that almost becomes kind of food for thought. Or I was on another conversation. I was like, well, that's the compost that you start with before the gardening process. And then I'll often have to get people kind of out of that day to day is to actually start not just thinking about the organization, but thinking about the wider environment. What are the trends that they're noticing in a variety of, within politics, environment, social, technology? And then of those trends, what are the ones that are really impacting their organization, their issue, their mission? And that kind of pushes people into bigger thinking, and into a wider, kind of widens the lens, if you will, that helps them get into that mindset to be able to think longer term.
That's great. Do you have any additional tips or last minute thoughts that you could recommend to the listeners?
I would say, definitely if you've never done a plan, take the time, invest in it. Even if you can't afford to have outside help that you're paying for, you may be able to get that help through, a graduate program locally that focuses on nonprofit management, a group of students that could help you with some of that research and facilitating a conversation. So there are lots of different ways that folks can tackle it, but also being mindful of, like, is this the right time to do strategic planning? Like I said, if they're in a crisis, maybe 6 months from now, maybe a year from now, once you've emerged from that. If they're about to go through a leadership transition, oftentimes the outgoing leader will want to, let's do the strategic planning now. And now I've set the course for the organization for the next 3 to 5 years. Well, actually, I'll say to them, that's the job of the next person. What we need to do now is do an organizational assessment so that the board's ready to hire the next person and knows what they need to do. But let that next person come in and really start to define, help be part of defining what the midterm future is. And so, yeah, about readiness, and then being mindful of whether they have the capacity. If they're launching a capital campaign and doing rebranding and thinking about a website, if they've got a bunch of really big other initiatives going on, it's also not the right time to do strategic planning. There needs to be enough time and bandwidth to really be able to focus on it.
And I think that's really key, right? You need to be able to have what I would call stability and kind of a little bit of a calm-ish. I know in nonprofits it's really kind of hard to find that time when, people are not busy because we're busy all the time. But finding that period where there isn't really those big things kind of happening to allow yourself the mental capacity to be able to focus and think more strategically.
And then once you've done one, oftentimes it will be, that 3 year, that 5 year, and then it can become a regular practice. And depending on where you are after that 3 years, it may be that you just need to, revisit the plan and refresh it. And it may be that you've really made progress and you need to envision for the future. And then I think the other really key thing is that what I always try to have clients make sure that they do is to not worry about trying to exactly predict what you're going to be doing in year 3 of the plan, but really only focus on getting into the nitty gritty in that year 1 action plan. So that you've had a conversation about how are we putting this into implementation? What are we prioritizing first? And then also setting a date for when you're going to review and update the plan, either 6 months or a year from now.
For sure. I think the action plan is, one of the big takeaways that come out of strategic planning. When I do strat planning for my business and my agency, we do 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, but then we also do a quarterly kind of like, let's check in. Here's where we're going for the year. Let's get together. What are the rocks? What are those like 3 big things that we can really focus on? And it might be different for different departments and different people in the organization, but really breaking it down so that you're all working towards these pieces that collectively will get you to where you want to be.
Yeah. And I think that you made a really good point of, like, the 3 things. I don't let groups have more than 5 goals, and that's probably too many. But sometimes you end up with 7, and it's like, okay, no, we got to rank these. We got to prioritize them because that's too much to try to take on in this period.
A couple bonus goals, right?
Yeah. So
they need to be smart goals, right? And achievable. So that's a very key point. So to everybody listening, I know today this episode was a little bit different than our typical kind of episode, but I think it's a really important topic. And for your organizations to start thinking about strategy and focus and gaining clarity on where you want to go and how you're going to get there, it's a really important piece for you. And so I hope that if you're listening, if you're still listening, that you've been able to get some really great advice from Carol and some pointers today from our conversation. Carol, during the pre-show, you mentioned a tool maybe for strategic planning that you've got. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we talked about one or two of the mistakes that organizations often make, but I have a downloadable resource on my website, the common mistakes that organizations make in strategic planning. So, and then kind of how to mitigate those as well. So that can flesh that out a little bit more. So at gracesocialsector.com, and there's a tab called Goodies. So just look under there, and you'll find the resource easily downloadable.
Amazing. And we're going to have a link on our show notes page. So you can go to nonprofitdigitalsuccess.com. That'll take you through to our podcast page. Find this episode, click on it, and we'll have links out there for anybody. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, what do they need to do?
Yeah, so just check out my website. We have a contact form there, gracesocialsector.com. Also invite folks to check out Mission Impact. And that's how to be in touch.
Fantastic. Thanks again so much for joining in, Carol. It's been great having you here on the Nonprofit Digital Success Podcast. Until next time, keep on being successful.